Whether you're looking for content on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best the Black community in Ottawa has to offer, and so much more. And better yet, do you have a project you need help with? Well, look no further. We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as TIA Envision to bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 3 of our course, What History Class Left Out, African History from 10,000 BCE to 711 CE. So I'm Dr. Clyde Ledbetter. We're going to jump right in and get started because we have a lot to discuss today, a lot of information. And again, like I said last week and even the week before, this is just a general history course. Each one of the topics that we discuss, you can take 15 weeks of a class just on these topics alone, just on Old Kingdom Egypt, or just on Nubia itself, or ancient Nubia, not even getting into modern Sudan. So there's a lot of information out there. We're just doing a general overview. So as always, I encourage people, use the course website, use the materials that are there, do your own research, and really fill in these gaps, because this is just a general overview. So as always, and I'm going to be very disciplined today, because last week we didn't get to really have the Q&A in the middle, and that's because I was given so much information I got carried away with the time. We're going to be disciplined today, and we're going to have our Q&A in the middle at 11:30. No matter where we're at in the discussion, hopefully I'm going to try to match it up. We're going to have our Q&A at 11:30, then we'll keep going for another 20, 25 minutes, and then we will have our unrecorded Q&A open discussion toward the end, right around 12:10, 12:15. All right, so let's jump in. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, and we will get to it in the first Q&A, or you can wait and raise your hand for the first Q&A as well. All right, session 3, what we are talking about today. We are going to be talking about Kemet, or ancient Egypt, Nubia, and the New Kingdom. So we're going to talk about the Middle and the New Kingdom, because last week I kind of stopped right after the discussion of the first intermediate period in ancient Egyptian history and started talking about the Middle Kingdom, but I don't want to gloss over the Middle Kingdom because it gets glossed over so much in history and in presentations of ancient Egypt. Not a lot is discussed about the Middle Kingdom because there's not a lot of big buildings. A lot of the large building projects are either in the Old Kingdom or the New Kingdom, and there's not a lot of major personalities in terms of the pharaohs and other figures the way we had in the Old Kingdom and what we will see later on in the New Kingdom. But the Middle Kingdom was a period of great literary production in ancient Egypt, and we need to talk about it. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about everyday people as well as the civilization of Nubia, which is just south of Egypt. And we're going to talk about the interactions between those two civilizations today. So just like last week, a lot of information. So last week we covered the Old and we started the Middle Kingdom, and just to get us geographically situated, we're talking about the top right corner of Africa, Northeast Africa. We're going to be talking about right on this map where it says Kush in classical Egypt. And when we see the name Kush, I want you to put 3 names in your mind when we talk about Kush. Kush is a name for Nubia, and it's also called Ethiopia. Kush, Nubia, Ethiopia, all inside of what's now modern-day Sudan. Those are the 3 names. Kush, Nubia, and Ethiopia. I will use them interchangeably. For the Greeks, this region was called Ethiopia. Everything south of Egypt was called Ethiopia by the Greeks. So this is where we get the name. So don't confuse it with modern-day Ethiopia, which is further south and to the east. All right. We talked about last week the chaos that occurred at the end of the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt. We talked about the civil wars that happened, the lack of central authority. There probably was some type of environmental problems as well. The Nile wasn't flooding the way it needed to flow. There was a lot of chaos during this time. A lot of isfet is what the ancient Egyptians would call it, isfet. It was not a ma'atic time. Wasn't a lot of balance and harmony and righteousness. So coming out of the 11th dynasty, we get the first intermediate period and then the Middle Kingdom. Just to kind of put this in perspective of time, we talked about this last week. This period that we're talking about is going from around 2000 BCE to 1785 BCE. We're going to go from there today, talking around 2000 BCE, all the way up to the end of the New Kingdom. So we're going to talk about 2,000 years of history. And again, compared to what's going on in the rest of the world, this is around the same time that China's first dynasties are emerging. This is around the same time that the Vedas, the sacred texts of the Hindus, is being written in India, and Indian civilization is blossoming. But this is way before we see anything happening in Greece. Way before we see anything happening in Greece. Greece doesn't start to emerge until 900 BCE. It's a much later time. All right, so the Middle Kingdom. This was a period where we start to see and learn more information about the everyday people in Egypt because of the literature that's being produced. You know, the evidence that we'll talk about today comes to us from archaeology. It also comes from the written sources because we have a lot of texts that have remained from this time period, whether there's text written on papyrus or text written in stone. We have a lot of information, literary information, about this time period in ancient Egypt. So, you know, we have things like this. The dialogue of Impuwer and the Lord of Awe. And this was really interesting. This was a rich man talking about the first intermediate period. And it's really interesting seeing his perspective of things because he talks about how the world was in chaos during the time that there was no central authority among the Egyptians, when there were these civil wars and chaos. He said, "Lo, offices are open, their records stolen. Woe is me for the grief of this time. Lo, the scribes of the land register, their books are destroyed. The grain of Egypt is, I go get it." I mean, it's up for grabs. People are just running into the grain storage and grabbing what they want. Lo, the laws of the chamber are thrown out. Men walk on them in the streets. Beggars tear them up in the alleys. See, he who had nothing is now a man of wealth. The nobleman sings his praise. See, the poor of the land has become rich, and the man of property is a pauper. So things are upside down during this intermediate period. There's chaos. But it's really interesting when we look at this, because this is from the perspective of a nobleman at this time, you know, coming out of the first intermediate period. So maybe for the poor people, for the working class folks, this might have been a great time because they weren't being overtaxed by these governors, by the central authority of the state, and they're able to go into the grain house when they want and get enough food for their family. It's the rich have become poor, and the poor have become rich. You know, this sounds very similar to things that Jesus will say later on, you know, when things get flipped around, when the last become first and the first become last. So chaos is subjective. It may have been chaotic for the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, but for the everyday people, it may have been a more democratic situation when you have a lack of central authority, a lack of this overarching state that's controlling things and controlling your life. So very interesting when we look at this testimony from one of the wealthy people back then. I do want to stop and talk a little bit about the writing that changes during this time period. We talked a little bit about language last week, but it's really important to point this out, that Egyptian writing goes through a number of stages, and just like any other writing, and we're talking about Middle Egyptian, so 2100 BCE to 1600 BCE, the language is different than Old Egyptian. Some of the words are the same, some of the vocabulary is the same, but there are major differences. And as students of history, when we study this time period and we talk about the evidence to discuss it, we have to rely on linguists and other scholars that are able to differentiate between these periods and to give us, okay, well, this was probably written during this time based off the language, or this was written during this time. And we can combine that with what was going on politically and looking at the archaeological record and other things to give us a good overview of what was happening. And more importantly, to remind us that African civilizations, just like civilizations all over the world, they change. Nothing stays static. Things change from generation to generation. That's very important to point out when we talk about African history. Because when we make historical claims about what Africans did or what Africans thought or what Africans didn't do, we always have to qualify that with at this time in African history, because things change. And that's really, really important for us to think about. Think about English. You know, English in the past 1,500 years has changed an incredible amount. You got Old English, and when I think about Old English, the first thing that actually comes to my mind is something else. So those of you in the States probably know what I'm talking about when I talk about Old English. It's a 40 ounce, but that's a whole different story. But Old English, from 450 CE to 1066 CE, it's hard to read Old English if you don't know what you're looking at. Then you have Middle English, which is, you know, the English of Chaucer and the English of the Canterbury Tales. You can read some of it, but some of it is very difficult to read. And then even modern English, 1500 to the present. But even that has changed because Shakespeare is a part of modern English. And if you've ever been in school and you had to read Shakespeare, you know it's not an easy read. You can't just breeze through it. You have to really stop and think about the words, even though you recognize many of these words. So languages change, cultures change, civilizations change, they adapt, they grow, and that's really important for us to point out. All right, so another one of the great texts of this period was the Book of Hunan Pu. This also came out during the Middle Kingdom. And it's a morality book. It's a book that deals with the Egyptians explaining what their ideal was in terms of law and order, and their ideal in terms of how do we treat people right? How do we treat people right? And it's written from the perspective of, again, a poor person, actually, you know, a working class person. A brother named Hunan Pu, who ran into some hard times. He needed to go sell some goods in the big city. He takes his goods, loads them up on his donkey. He's making his way to the big city. A rich man sees him coming, passing his land. And this rich man, this man that has a vast estate and he's wealthy and the politicians know him and all that, he decides that he wants to take even the little that Hunan Pu has. And he sets up these barriers and he takes Hunan Pu's stuff and he beats Hunan Pu. And Hunan Pu is destitute because he was just trying to, you know, raise some money for his family. And he ends up going to the law. He goes to the governor of the region. Because remember, Egypt still has a strong central authority. You have the pharaoh, but you also have governors and an entire bureaucracy underneath the pharaoh. Egypt was a complex civilization. You know, a lot of government officials, very much like Canada. You can go straight to the prime minister. The steps. You got to go to this person and this person and this person. So he goes to the governor, and he says, "This rich man has taken my goods. He beat me. I want some justice. I want some ma'at." We talked about ma'at last week. It's a catchword it's a catch philosophy, we'll call it, for harmony and balance and righteousness and justice. So he says, "I want ma'at to be done. It's not right what happened to me. Where is the law?" And he makes this passionate plea. Another title of this book that you'll find if you Google it, some people refer to this book as The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, because he gives these great speeches in audience of the governor. And the pharaoh hears about this. The pharaoh actually hears about this, and he tells the governor to keep delaying justice for this man, so that way he can keep coming back and telling his story and telling us about the virtues of ma'at and doing ma'at and the law and order and everyone being equal under the law, whether you're rich or poor or whatever. So he keeps coming back day after day after day, making these pleas. And eventually he gets to the point where he starts insulting the governor and insulting people and saying, "You don't do ma'at and no one's going to write your history," and blah, blah, blah. And he goes in till finally the pharaoh does instruct the governor to give Hunan Pu all his goods back, and then tenfold, and the story ends happily. But more importantly than just being a story, it is a morality tale. It is a philosophical text dealing with key ideas, such as everyone being equal under the law. Human rights. This man had rights that couldn't be violated just because he was a poor person or a working class person. So very important text. And it goes back somewhere between 1985 to 1733 BCE. This is a text from almost 4,000 years ago that are talking about ideas that we're still struggling with in terms of how do we treat everyone in our society equal, no matter of how much wealth they have or don't have. Andrew, go ahead.
When you put it in that perspective, it's kind of sad because back then, let's say if the guy who wrote this were to observe us today, what would he think? Because some things have changed, I'll admit, but some things are still the same. Some people are still being treated unfairly for no justifiable reason, and like knowing that 4,000 years later, not much has happened. It's like, what's humanity doing?
Yeah,
Like,
that's a good.
come
That's
on,
yeah,
what's
it's
happening?
really good to point that out. And leaving on, you're right. And then looking back, we can understand that when we don't know about this book, we don't know about this history, then we think that human beings have just been grappling with this stuff now. And maybe if we had learned this and kept this in our historical records and, used it as something that we used in schools, maybe we could be further along. But this is why it's important for us to always consider history, to know our ancestors were talking about these ideas 4,000 years ago. That's a great contribution. All right, moving forward. Another text, another Ipuwer. This is one from around 1800 BCE. And I use this one to show, again, something that Andrew pointed out just now. A lot of the problems that we're dealing with nowadays, people were dealing with 4,000 years ago. This man is dealing with some serious depression and mental health problems. And he's thinking about actually killing himself. He says, I open my mouth to my soul. This text is also called a dialogue between a man and his soul. Because this guy is really on some hard times. He's really depressed. And he said, I open my mouth to my soul that I might answer what it has said. This is too much for me today, that my soul no longer talks with me. It is really too great to be exaggerated. It is like abandoning me. Let not my soul go away. It should wait for me because of, and then we lose that. There is no more competent person who deserts on the day of misfortune. Behold, my soul wrongs me, but I do not listen to it, dragging myself toward death before I come to it and casting myself upon the fire to burn myself up. May it be near to me on the day of misfortune and wait on that side, meaning death. My soul is stupid to try to win over one wretched over life and delay me from death before I can come to it. And ultimately, at the end of this text, the guy decides not to kill himself. His soul convinces him not to kill himself. But it's a much longer text, but it goes back and forth between this man and his soul, him contemplating suicide. So again, 4,000 years ago, we have this text where the soul actually convinces man that, yeah, your life is bad, but things can get better. So before you decide to go to that other side, think about how we can work to make our lives better and what we can do. So very interesting. All the way back, 1800 BCE. Another text from around the same time period, the Maxims of Ptahhotep. It's a book of advice from father to son, from Ptahhotep the elder to Ptahhotep the younger. And among the wisdom that's given in this textbook, there's some things in this text, there's some things that are valid in 2023 just as much as they were in 1800 BCE. Ptahhotep the elder tells his son, don't be haughty because of your knowledge, but take counsel with the unlearned man as well as with the learned. For no one has ever attained perfection of competence, and there is no craftsman who has acquired full mastery. Good advice is rarer than emeralds, but yet it may be found even among women at the grindstones. Don't think you know everything. Listen to everyone. You can get knowledge from anyone. 1800 BCE, almost 4,000 years ago, still valid. If you're a man of trust, one who sits in the counsel of his Lord, direct your attention toward excellence. Your silence will be more profitable than babbling. So speak only when you know that you are qualified to do so. So many people in 2023 should take this advice. I sit in meetings sometimes in places and people just love to hear themselves talk. They just babble and babble, and it's like, you're not doing yourself any favors. It's better to speak and say something profound with a small amount of words, and people will say, yeah, that makes sense, let's move on that, versus in just talking and talking and talking, because sometimes your message just gets lost in people's boredom. So if you're in a position, you're at a meeting, you're in a situation, be, contrite with your words. Last one, if you're wealthy after being destitute and have amassed riches after poverty in a town where people know about you, don't boast of what has come to you in the past, and do not be too confident in your possessions which have come to you as gifts of the God. Very important. When you come into some money in a place, in a neighborhood that people knew when you was broke, don't be boasting and going on Facebook. Well, they didn't have Facebook back then, but don't be going out on social media talking about all the things that you have. Be, humble about it. Because just as quick as you got those riches, you can lose them. Then, just as valid in 2023 as it is in 1800 BCE. So that Middle Kingdom period, again, it was a time of strong centralized authority when the new pharaohs had come in, led by Mentuhotep I. He comes up from the south, reestablishes central authority. He actually redoes the bureaucracy, makes it even tighter. It's not an internal threat that causes Egypt to go into its second intermediate period. It's an external threat. It's the Hyksos, a group of people that we still aren't 100% sure where they come from, somewhere in Western Asia. They come into Egypt and they do a number on Egypt. And the reason why they have a technological advantage, they come into Egypt with the horse-drawn chariot, and they're able to take over a lot of the Delta region and then again put Egypt into an intermediate period. Egypt is also dealing with problems in the south on its southern border, which is Upper Egypt. Because with the invasion of the Hyksos, you also have the rise of a stronger Nubia. Now let's talk about Nubia. And we're going to talk about Nubia before we get into the Old Kingdom. So Nubia and Egypt are brother-sister civilizations. They are traditionally separated by what's called the First Cataract. It's an area in the Nile River where it's incredibly rocky. It's almost like waterfall type thing, and it's hard to pass through. Like boat, you have to go on land and go around the First Cataract. So it's been a traditional border between Nubia and Egypt. At the early stages, so I'm going back a little bit in time. When we look back at the archaeological record, between 7,000 BCE and 3,000 BCE, right around the time of the beginning of the Old Kingdom, the civilizations above and below the First Cataract are very similar. When we're talking about Lower Nubia and Upper Egypt, they were very similar civilizations. We know that from the archaeological record. But then things start to change. A lot of it is based off of the topography and the geography of the two regions. Once you start to get further south of the First Cataract, and you're going into Lower Nubia, then ultimately to Upper Nubia, because Nubia is oriented the same way as Egypt, where Lower Egypt is in the north and Upper Egypt is in the south. Lower Nubia is in the north, Upper Nubia is in the south, because of the direction that the Nile River flows. The Nile River flows from south to north, so that's how they oriented their civilizations. As you get further south, you get less desert, especially back then. Now, it's not the same today because of climate change and other things and the growing of the Sahara, but back then, Sudan was a lot greener than it is today. So when you get into Nubia, things start to get a lot greener. You get a lot more pasture land. You get a lot more trees. And this affected how the civilization developed. Up in Egypt, you only have land on both sides of the Nile River on a narrow strip. So land becomes much more of a commodity and is not really suitable for pastoral living. Meaning you're not going to have large herds of animals because that land is valuable. You need it for agriculture. So Egypt becomes much more agriculturally based. They grow grain and they're very good at it because of the fertility of the Nile. Whereas Nubia is semi-nomadic herding and some agriculture. So they have more land to work with. So they can have large herds of goats and cows and those types of things to graze on land. And you can move, once you exhaust the pasture, you move your animals to another pasture, semi-nomadic herding. And then as well as agriculture. And then you have trees, you have fruit trees, you have trees that you can use for building materials. So it's very different than Egypt. Because of the movement of people, power was decentralized in Nubia. Loosely centralized versus highly centralized in Egypt. The periods that Egypt is strong, high centralization of government. You have the pharaoh, you have the bureaucracy, you have the governors, you have a chain of command. In Nubia, not so much. You can't be a dictator in Nubia, a strong leader like that in Nubia, because people could just move. They're like, we don't like this taxation thing you're trying to pull, so I'm just gonna take my flock and I'm gonna go over here. And there's nothing that they could do about that. So you had that. Because of that, Egypt developed writing much earlier than Nubia. The Nubians didn't need writing. Writing is not something that you need. Because of the bureaucracy in ancient Egypt and the tight control of the government over things, they needed records to be kept. about land surveys and grain storage and how to read the Nilometer to see, the level that the Nile was. They needed this writing to maintain their bureaucracy and their administration. You didn't need that in Nubia, so writing wasn't developed until much later on. Nubia was richer in mineral wealth. You had gold in Nubia. You had animal furs that were very valuable at the time. You would eventually have iron ore. I mean, you had the iron ore that was there, but it's going to be exploited later on to make Nubia one of the greatest iron-producing nations in Africa during ancient times. But that comes a few centuries later. Both buried their dead, but Egypt used mummification. There weren't mummies in Nubia. The archaeological record that we have of Nubia is not as dense as what we get for Egypt because of this environment. In Egypt, things dried out, so you're able to have, and then with the process of mummification, you have mummies. You have things that are written in stone. You have a lot, and with the writing, we can, resurrect or recreate what was actually going on historically. In Nubia, we have a ton of archaeological evidence, but it's in a different form than Egypt. You have a lot of pottery in both places because pottery is hard to destroy, so we can tell a lot from pottery. We can tell about the similarities between the early Egyptian civilization and the early Nubian civilization because they share the same techniques in terms of pottery. So we know that there was cultural exchanges. We find Egyptian goods in Nubian burials. So we know that people were exchanging goods between Nubia and Egypt. But in Nubia, you don't have a lot of the stone buildings that you have in Egypt. And there's a reason for that. The Nubians were building with wood because they had wood. In Egypt, there's not a lot of trees to be cut down to build buildings. That's why they had to build out of stone. The Nubians, they had trees. But when a building burns down or the trees rot and decay, there's no archaeological record the same way you have with stone. I mean, it is, but it's not as, evident. You had to use other archaeological techniques to recreate what was going on. You can also kind of get an understanding of how big buildings were and what things were based off of the indentation that these wooden posts would make in the ground. So when you do archaeology in Nubia, you're looking for these indentations. All right, there was a post here, there was a post here, there was a post here. All right, this building must have been this big and this high and that type of thing. All right, so this is kind of a good chart to show you the similarities and differences of these brother-sister civilizations. They had similar religious beliefs during the Middle and New Kingdoms. A general rule is this: whenever Egypt was weak, Nubia was strong. And whenever Nubia was weak, Egypt was strong. Because they would constantly be fighting, particularly Lower Nubia, they would always be fighting over that first cataract. Now, Egypt wanted access to the goods that were coming out of Nubia, the gold, the other trade that was coming from interior Africa that Nubians had access to. The Egyptians wanted control of that. And then when the Egyptians were weak, the Nubians pressed themselves over the first cataract into Egypt. That way they could control Egyptian grain and the like. But because of those cultural exchanges, they shared a lot of religious similarities between the Middle and New Kingdom. And particularly during that Middle Kingdom period, Middle Kingdom pharaohs had taken offensive maneuvers against Nubia and had taken control over a lot of Lower Nubia. And with that, they also took control of a lot of the Nubian royalty. And they took their children to be educated in Egypt. So there was this cultural exchange that way. But then when the Hyksos come in from the north and destabilize things in Egypt, the Nubians see this as their opportunity, and they start fighting Egypt from the south. So during that second intermediate period, Egypt is all jacked up because they're getting attacked from both sides. And the Nubians are fierce fighters, and the Egyptians know this. We look geographically, this is what we're saying when we talk about Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. So this is modern Sudan, what you're looking at. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about Lower Nubia in the north, Upper Nubia in the south. And you see Egypt up there. And that first cataract right there, which is submerged right now underneath the Aswan Dam, which is another reason why we know so much about Nubia. In fact, we learned a lot about Nubia in the early 20th century, the early to mid 20th century. Since the 1700s, 1800s, we have tremendous archaeology going on in Egypt. Not so much in Sudan. until they decide to build the Aswan High Dam near the first cataract. While they're in the process of building this dam and laying out the plans to build this dam, someone says, hey, we should probably investigate to see if there's any archaeological information before we flood this area to create this dam. When they investigate, they find so much about Nubian history that they say we have to hold off for a while building this dam because we need to do an extensive archaeological survey of this area. And UNESCO in the mid-20th century is involved in this. And quite frankly, they did a good job, but it wasn't complete. And there are some things that are probably still underneath the Aswan Dam, submerged underwater, that we'll probably not have access to forever. But that was what started off this Nubian phase of studying African history. So, archaeology and the written record. When we talk about Nubia, we can learn about Nubia from the ancient Egyptian writing about Nubia, the Greeks wrote about Nubia, the Romans wrote about Nubia, the Hebrews wrote about Nubia, or Cush. And in the Bible, Cush is named in the Bible just as much as, almost as much as Egypt. Egypt is named the most in the Bible. Cush is named a good amount as well. The ancient Ethiopians in what's now modern Ethiopia wrote about Cush and Ge'ez. And then we have the Meroitic script, which I explained before. Most of the information we have about ancient Nubia comes from the Egyptians, which we have to put a little bit of an asterisk next to. Because when the Egyptians wrote about Nubia, they wrote about Nubia the way the United States would write about Mexico. It was not objective. They're writing from the perspective of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were incredibly nationalistic, especially when they were strong. When they had a strong central government and things were going well in Egypt, you couldn't tell the Egyptians nothing. They loved being Egyptians. They saw Egypt as the center of the earth, and everybody else was kind of lesser than. There wasn't racism, but it was strong nationalism. They said, we're Egyptians, we're strong, we're blessed by God, and everybody else either trade with us or get out the way. So when they wrote about Nubia, it was slanted. So if they lost a skirmish to Nubia, they wouldn't write it so much like that. They would come up with all types of excuses, or they wouldn't even mention it at all. But the archaeological record shows that they built fortifications. So that means you were afraid of something, even if you didn't write it in your record. Then if they had victories over Nubia, let's say they defeated 500 troops. In reality, but they would write, we defeated 5,000 Nubians with only 50 troops. Like the exaggerations to make Egypt seem bigger. Andrew, go ahead.
It's sort of like the way today, like the U.S., it's like they're so proud of themselves.
Yeah.
They think, I know I'm an American, but they're so full of themselves. They think, I'm American, I'm the best. So it's sort of like in the perspective, and like you said, they exaggerate things.
Yeah.
Like you had a good example, or like the U.S. They act like they did a lot in World War I, and maybe they did, but it's kind of exaggerated because they got to the war late.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah,
very much so.
Sure, they might have lost a few troops, but compared to like Britain, they didn't do as much as even Canada. Canada did more than the U.S. did.
There you go. And this is the type of, and the Egyptians knew. They knew the power of Sankofa. They knew the power of history. So they're writing these things down. They're putting it on their monuments for a reason, to show that they're this great nation and to keep it in the historical record. So we always have to, we take what the Egyptians wrote and we use it, but we always remember that, okay, we have to double check if this is being exaggerated, or we have to understand whose perspective this is coming from, and do we have an archaeological record that we can pair with this written record to see what actually happened. All right, I'm gonna give me 5 more minutes and then we'll take our first Q&A. A lot of the people that are doing the work right now, and unfortunately, I like to highlight the African archaeologists that are doing this work, because unfortunately in Egypt and in Sudan, most of the work to uncover this history is actually being done by Europeans. There's a lot of German archaeological teams in Egypt and in Sudan, Russian, Ukrainian, I don't know how much so right now because of the war, US, British, French archaeological teams. Not a lot of control by Africans over what's going on. So one of the things I always like to mention in these classes, when you talk to your young people and they're thinking about careers, archaeology is a great career. You might think, and many of us that are black folks, when we think about jobs and we tell our kids, all right, you can become a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer. It's like there's only 3 jobs that black people can do. But we have to tell our young people that there's so many ways that you can help record history. You don't have to become a history teacher. You can become an archaeologist. There's so much science involved in archaeology. Paleo vegetation studies and how to use thermoluminescence dating and carbon-14 dating. There's so much there and so much technology being created to resurrect our history. Every time I open up books about our history, most of the primary sources that are being discovered by Europeans. And I'm not saying that Europeans shouldn't be doing this work. Whoever's doing the work should do the work, but we need more of us in these spaces. So just keep that in mind when your kids say, I want to become an archaeologist. Don't laugh at them, encourage them. But, because we got black ones, like Mahmoud Suleiman Bashir, a Sudanese archaeologist who works for the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums in Sudan. You got people like Anthony Browder, African-American, the first African-American to lead an archaeological dig in Egypt. And currently his dig is dealing with the time that the Nubians took over Egypt in the 25th dynasty, which we'll talk about soon. You got people like my mentor who works at the university I work at, Dr. Virgilette Nzinga Gaffin, who has worked with Tony Browder and goes to Egypt usually every other year and does archaeological digs. And she can actually read the Meta Neter, and she is there actually going into these places, dusting off the things and sorting them so that we can learn more about this history. Archaeological discoveries are happening every day, and we need more of our people to know that our people are on the ground, but we need more, and we need more young people. Yes?
I heard once that what we've discovered in Egypt so far and like in many other places, that's just a fraction.
It's just a fraction.
There's so much more. And like the fact that you said they made the Aswan Dam, the fact that there could be something that's lost and we'll never discover it, that's like really sad. It could be something revolutionary.
It could be. It could be another Rosetta Stone that would help us with this Meroitic script, so we would know what the Nubians actually said about Egypt instead of just relying on what the Egyptians said about the Nubians. And it's really miraculous if you really think about it, how much stuff that we've found. Because again, these things have been there for 5,000, 4,000 years. And it's not like people weren't stealing from graves. People were. People were stealing from graves over these 1,000 years, but they didn't take everything. So the fact that we even have this much information is really miraculous. All right, last thing I'll talk about before we take our first break, and then I'll get back into Nubia and talk about the New Kingdom. A recent book, if you're really interested in learning about ancient Nubia, from right around 5,000 BCE all the way up until, I think this book goes into the Christian period of Nubia. So that would be, up to the 400 CEs. If you're interested in this book, interested in this topic, the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Nubia came out in 2021. It is a book, I think it's a couple of thousand pages, but it's a compilation of a number of different scholars' works on various topics in ancient Nubian history. If you get a chance to get a copy of this book, I think it's in paperback now, get it, and you can learn a great deal about Nubia. This was done by Emberling and Williams, were the editors, and there's a number of other scholars that are involved in it. So a lot of the stuff that I talk about comes out of this text, if you want to double check what I'm saying. So before I get into talking about Nubia, let me go to open up the floor to any questions that folks may have. I have Abdallah here, because Daniel's not here. I have Brother Abdallah who's working in the chat for me, and I don't see anything in the chat, no questions. So, Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Morning all. This topic this morning is quite interesting to me. Empires, dynasties versus civilization. The rule of law and order most of the time were imposed. Yet we have no chance but to live by them most of the time. Because we don't have the chance to defend yourself. We can't afford to defend yourself. And all of these dynasties and empires were built on practice.
That's true. And you can even add on that when we talk about the law and order and during his times, it was also based in the spirituality as well. It wasn't just people engaging with the law because it was secular. Every official also had a spiritual, aspect to it as well, all the way up to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was seen as a spiritual figure. So the law was intertwined not only with, the everyday goings-on, but also with the spirituality. And we're going to talk about when one Pharaoh in particular tried to upend a lot of that in a second. But yes, and it's really interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
If we look, for instance, at the tax laws, and why most of them came in, a lot of them was for trade.
Yep.
For lack of trade, and the parameters for which you could trade and why you could trade, and we have to abide by them.
Yeah, and this is where that bureaucracy emerges, and we see all of the things that we see now in terms of taxation and all of these, and land surveying and all this. It goes back to ancient Egypt. They were doing all of these things. They had tax laws. Everybody had to pay a certain amount of taxes. And contrary to popular belief, and I forgot to clear this up last week, when we look at the monuments in ancient Egypt, a lot of us that come out of a Christian, Judaic, Islamic experience, we connect ancient Egypt with the trials and tribulations of the ancient Hebrews in Egypt. And we have in our mind that monuments such as these are the ones in Sudan, which is another fun fact. There's more pyramids in Sudan, in Nubia, than there were in Egypt. They just were smaller, but there's more. But there's a belief that these monuments were built by enslaved labor. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was exploited labor, yes, but not enslaved labor. There's a difference. And even if you read the Bible in ancient Hebrew, they're not referred to as slaves. They're an oppressed group. But one of the ways that these people paid taxes in ancient Egypt, they paid with their labor. So every year, every April, we have to pay taxes to CRA. We got to fill out forms. We got to give them money or whatever. Well, they were not dealing with a cash economy back then. So people had to exchange either goods, part of their crop or whatever, or they could exchange their labor. You have to spend a certain amount of weeks or months working on this building project for the state in lieu of actually paying taxes. So and we call this corvée labor. A lot of this was corvée labor. And you even have, then you have people that are employed by the states as craftsmen. And we're going to talk about when those folks get disgruntled and they go on strike. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. So a lot of the misconceptions about Egypt, just as this taskmaster and whipping people and forcing people to build these things, that's not the accurate portrayal of what's actually going on. We're dealing with a sophisticated bureaucracy, a sophisticated tax code, both internal taxing as well as taxing trade between going up and down the Nile between Nubia, people trying to come in from Western Asia to trade. So the pharaohs controlled a lot of that. We're going to see that actually throughout African history, is the control of trade made a lot of these empires and kingdoms incredibly rich and incredibly powerful. All right, so just wanted to clear that up. David H., go ahead.
Thank you, and good morning. Can you let me know which came first in the timeline, the Maxims of Ptahhotep or the Proverbs of Solomon?
Yeah, that's not even a hard question. The Maxims of Ptahhotep was around 1800 BCE. The Wisdom of Solomon is not written until probably at the earliest 600 BCE, so there's a whole 1,200-year difference because there's no written Hebrew language for a while. So we're talking about at least 1,000 years of a difference.
Okay, thank you, kind of.
But you have a lot of these wisdom texts throughout the ancient world that existed. So, and it couldn't have existed because Solomon didn't live even until maybe 900 BCE, so there's a significant gap. But you can see the similarities in all these types of wisdom knowledge because, again, and I don't want to make the African experience as if it's somehow higher than or better than other human experiences. It's just our experience and we can learn a lot from it. But human beings all over the world have similar types of wisdom knowledge because human beings around the world act in similar ways to each other. So you can look at ancient European writing and ancient Indian subcontinent writing and ancient Chinese wisdom, and you'll see a lot of similarities because people have a way of mistreating each other, no matter what cultures that we're in, that we all need to deal with. So it's always important to talk about those things. Thank you for that. Gloria Anderson, go ahead.
Yeah, when you were telling the morality story about the man who kept going back for justice, it just reminded me so much of one of Jesus' parables about the woman. There was a woman who kept going back to the judge, and I think eventually they said, give her justice before she wears me down, or something like that. But it just shows, as you said, sort of following on just on what you just said now, the similarity in human behavior.
Very much so. Similarity, and in a lot of cases in that area of the world, we even have, direct influence, because particularly when we talk about this New Kingdom period of Egypt, Egypt becomes a superpower in the time period that we're about to talk about next. So let's get back into it, and we'll hold off. So again, these are just examples of some of the pyramids that you'll find in Sudan. There's a lot more of them than there are in Egypt, but they're just on a smaller scale. And you have to put in your mind's imagination, it didn't look like this at the time that these were built. This area was much more green. In fact, you can kind of see in this picture, you can kind of see some vestiges of the green. So imagine this area being a lot more green than it was. That's what Nubia looked like. Nubia was a lot greener than Egypt. All right, so the Egyptians referred to Nubia as Ta-Seti, particularly Lower Nubia as Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, because of how proficient the Nubians were as archers, with bow and arrow fighting. In fact, Egypt would often use Nubians as mercenaries in their wars. And when there were civil wars that were happening inside of Egypt, whether it be that first intermediate period or even the second intermediate period, the Egyptians would pay Nubians to fight on their side. And then sometimes the Nubians would fight against them, but they recognized the skill of the Nubians. They were often even called pupil smiters, because they were so accurate that from hundreds of yards away, they could shoot a bow and arrow and hit you right in the eye. The pupil smiters. So Ta-Seti, the land of the bow. I just like to show this image as well, because you can see how connected Nubia was with the rest of Africa. Whether we're going west toward Darfur and Chad and Lake Chad, and Nubia had connections with what's now Ethiopia, going down into Zaire, the Central African Republic. So when we actually decipher that Meroitic script, we're going to get even more information about what was going on in the rest of Africa during this time, once that's deciphered. Really important to point that out. All right, so eventually, though, the Egyptians are able to get the Hyksos out of Egypt and even to push the Nubians back across the First Cataract, and that ends the Second Intermediate Period. And this is done under a pharaoh by the name of Ahmose I. Ahmose I. And it's during the New Kingdom. It started in the Middle Kingdom, but definitely in the New Kingdom, you see a lot of pharaohs with this last name, Mos, or Meses. It means child of. In this case, it's the child of Ah. You'll see Tutmos, which is a child of Tut. So Mos, Meses, it's a child of. This is going to get adopted by the ancient Hebrews, who has one of their main figures, Moses. It's the same root word. In the Bible, it says Moses means, he was named Moses because he was brought out of the river. It's not really, it's Meses, it means child of. It's a suffix. So this is kind of where it comes from. We see a lot of Egyptian cultural influence throughout the region of Western Asia, parts of Africa, and we definitely see it in ancient Palestine where those texts were written and those stories were told. And even in the Bible, it talks about Moses was trained by the Egyptians, and there was no Hebraic writing at the time. So if there was no Hebrew writing, and Moses goes up to the Mount Sinai and he gets the Ten Commandments, and they're written, and he has to read them to people, what language do you think they were written in? Because the only thing he could read was ancient Egyptian. So if you look at the Ten Commandments, if they were a historical document, they probably would have been written in the language that he could read, which would have been ancient Egyptian. Yeah.
A quick question that I often find confusing. It's like between like the Bible and like Egypt, like we haven't really found any archaeological evidence. So like, what's that about? Because we haven't found any evidence for the Blood River or like the plagues. All we have is like the book that was written. So it gets kind of confusing. Like, is there a part of it that's made up, or is there something we haven't like discovered? Like, we haven't seen all of Egypt. Could it perhaps be there? So
It's a combination of both things. I mean, there's allegorical parts of the Bible that were never meant to be taken literally. They're allegory, and even the ancients knew that they were allegory, and it was more important about the message that you got out of it versus actually thinking that this actually happened this way. But in terms of the plagues, that's a very interesting thing too, because we know that a lot of those plagues actually happened at various times in Egypt, but not in the way that the Bible describes. So there are times when the Nile River and other rivers around the world do turn red. It's because of an algae buildup, and it looks like it's blood, but it's this algae buildup that makes the rivers turn red. And then what happens? The fish die, and the things start dying in the river because of this algae buildup. And then when the fish die, what happens? Flies and things start coming on the fish, so it looks like a plague of flies. And I say, so all these things start to come together.
and they didn't like know what it was.
Exactly. So you get these things that, so there's a lot to that. There's a lot to it. That's a whole different discussion we can get into, but I'll go off into a tangent, but that's a good question though. And more importantly, to go to that question, and I want everybody to get this, because we're going to talk about this later on in other sessions. There is a difference between your faith and history, and they don't always align. It doesn't mean one is greater than the other. Whatever helps you get through your life and connect with your family and do things, but that's fine. But don't confuse the two. The Bible is not necessarily a historical source. There's history in it, because there are historical figures that are named. We're going to talk about a few, but it was never designed to be a history book. When the folks were writing down the scriptures in the Bible and in the Quran, these weren't designed to be history books. They don't meet the standards of what we call in the academy this is historical method, because that's not what they were designed to be for. They were designed to influence people about how God works in humanity and what God wants of humanity. That's what they're designed to do. So always separate the two things. We can use these spiritual sources as part of our history, but they're not historical sources. Just keep that in mind. All right, so Ahmose I, he's the pharaoh that drove out the Hyksos, the folks that came from Western Asia, and started the New Kingdom. And his descendants were some of the most famous pharaohs as part of what's called the 18th dynasty. He's the founder of the 18th dynasty of pharaohs. And there's some big names in this dynasty of his descendants. You have a couple of generations after him, the three Tutmoses, and we'll talk about them. Then you have Hatshepsut, one of the most powerful female pharaohs in Egyptian history. Then you have Amenhotep III, who was a great ruler. Then Amenhotep IV, who was also Akhenaten. We'll talk about him in a second. And then the very famous, probably the most famous pharaoh, it's probably a toss-up. If you want to ask an everyday person to name a pharaoh, they'll say one of two people. They'll either say Ramses, not understanding that there's a bunch of Ramses, but they're talking about Ramses II. So they'll either say Ramses or they'll say King Tut, King Tutankhamun. King Tutankhamun is also part of this 18th dynasty. The interesting thing is, Tutankhamun is not really that important. He didn't reign that long. He started as a child and he dies. But because of the archaeological find associated with him, this is why he becomes so important. Yes?
Wasn't Akhenaten, that's King Tut's father?
That's his father.
I think
Yeah.
he's more famous because like he tried to like really mess the religion up.
We're going to talk about
The
that.
reason Tut is so famous is because, as you said, like 1922, they
Yeah.
found his tomb.
That's what made him famous, because most tombs had been picked over, things had been stolen from them, but his tomb was secluded in such a way that when the door was open, everything was there. All of these gold items, all of this stuff was just there, and no one had stolen from it yet. Grave robbery was really big in ancient times. So this is why he's so important. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Let's go through some of these people. Let's start with Hatshepsut, because her story is really interesting, and she's one of the most powerful women in the ancient world. Hatshepsut was the daughter, and this gets confusing, so we got to slow down and really make this make sense. She's the daughter of Thutmose I, who was a great general and had started to expand Egypt's borders. They had made some entrees into Nubia, taking over parts of Lower Nubia, and they're also making entrees into Western Asia to control trade routes, particularly in Palestine and going into Syria and so on. She's the daughter of Thutmose I. She is married to her brother, Thutmose II. And when I say that, it's not surprising in the ancient world. There were a lot of brother-sister marriages, cousin marriages, all that type of stuff. Royalty wanted to keep their blood and their connections to the royal family as much as possible. Now, she has a son, stepson, named Thutmose III. That's not actually, she didn't bear Thutmose III. So her brother and her were married, but more than likely they didn't consummate their marriage. It's not like they had a physical relationship. They're just married. He had other wives. So one of his other wives bore him Thutmose III. Now, when Thutmose II died, his only heir, a male heir, Thutmose III, was too young to rule. But Hatshepsut, his wife/sister, was. And she takes over as pharaoh, first as regent. What a regent is it's the understanding that I'm going to rule as pharaoh until this child is of mature age and then they can take over. However, Hatshepsut was so skillful in terms of being a diplomat. She leads an expedition not leads, but she pays for and encourages an expedition to the land of Punt, which is either modern-day Somalia or Eritrea. She rebuilds a number of temples. She creates around her a situation where many of the leading generals, religious figures, and other high political figures in Egypt see her as she's going to be a very good pharaoh. Let's back her. So by the time Thutmose III becomes an adult, she's like, you know what, I'm just going to stay pharaoh. So she keeps ruling as pharaoh. And there's nothing that he can do to challenge her because she has the solidarity and support of so many other high officials in the kingdom. In fact, right before Thutmose gets of age where he can actually become the pharaoh, she sends him for military training somewhere way in the south of Egypt to get trained militarily. It's actually going to benefit him because he becomes one of the most skillful generals in ancient time. But that's not why she did it. She didn't train him so that he could become a great general. She wanted to get him away from the capital so that she can continue to rule. And she does, and she rules well. By all accounts, she builds great temples like the one that you see here, great statues. She presents herself as more manly in a lot of her images, not because she wanted to be a man, but because she wanted to show the power of authority of the pharaoh. Rules very well, then she dies, regular death. She's not assassinated or anything like that. However, when her stepson now takes over, he's mad because he's been denied for many years the right to rule as pharaoh outright. So he defaces a number of her temples and takes a number of the things that she did and claims them for herself. And we can see this very clear in the archaeological record where her name is just literally just X'd out and then his name is put over it or underneath it or her statues are defaced and these things. European scholars, with their understanding of gender roles and their own male chauvinism, when they were studying this period, they said, this must have been done because the Egyptians thought it was so outrageous to have a woman as their ruler, that they defaced her property and did all this. But not understanding that, going all the way back like we talked about last week, in the Old Kingdom, in the first dynasty, you had female rulers of Egypt. So they weren't mad that it was a female. Tutmosis was mad personally because his stepmother had usurped the throne from him, not because she was a woman, but because what she had done by not allowing him to become pharaoh. So that's the reason why they were defaced. So that's very important when we talk about how people have their own cultural baggage when they interpret history. They can give you an interpretation that has nothing to do with what actually went down. Andrew, go ahead.
It kind of reminds me of Akhenaten. Some people say he was actually assassinated, but the important thing is after he died, people were so angry at what he did that they defaced everything. They tore down his temples. They even defaced his coffin.
You're giving us a preview of something to come. Hold off on that because we're about to talk about that in 2 seconds. Because it's the same. This is all the same family too. Everything we're going to talk about. This is all the 18th dynasty. These are grandfather, granddaughters. All this is the same family. So when he does become pharaoh, he's been trained as a general. He's a fighter, and he's going to continue the expansion of Egypt. This is when Egypt becomes a world superpower in terms of its ability to control its neighbors. So under Thutmose III, this is one of his temples where you see him conquering all these people. He's like he's grabbing these people and he's about to smite them. An image that we see goes all the way back to Narmer. He establishes Egypt all the way up to northern Iraq. This is the greatest extent of the ancient Egyptian empire. This is when Egypt becomes an empire and starts subjugating other people. Palestine, all the way up to Syria, up to northern Iraq. This is really important. And he comes Nubia as well to the Second Cataract. Very important time period. And he never loses a battle, apparently. Now, again, we have to rely on Egyptian records for this. But even the archaeological record shows, because we can find his markers all over this region. Markers dedicated to Thutmose III, all the way up into Syria and these places. So one of the most famous battles in ancient history, the Battle of Megiddo, which the Bible is also talks about, but in the future tense. When we talk about the Battle of Armageddon, that's at this place called Megiddo. Megiddo is a very strategic area in Palestine. And a lot of the ancient world, they fought over this, because if you can control Palestine, this region, you can control the trade that's coming from Egypt up into Western Asia. So very strategic place. A battle was fought there, and Thutmose used an incredible tactic to rout his enemies, and it's all written about in ancient Egyptian sources. I'm going to go a little bit faster, but you can do a whole class just on the 18th dynasty with these amazing pharaohs. So we go a little bit further in, and a couple of generations after Thutmose III and Thutmose IV and all that, you get to the Amenhoteps. And eventually, after another strong Amenhotep, Amenhotep III, you get to Amenhotep IV, which is Akhenaten, who Andrew has been talking about. Akhenaten was a very interesting cat. And it was really important to understand what's going on politically and spiritually at the time. Ever since the Middle Kingdom, ever since Menhotep re-established central control, and he was based out of the city of Waset, which the Greeks called Karnak, wait, I'm getting that mixed up. The Greeks called it Thebes, the Arabs call it Karnak, but the city of Waset. Ever since then, their god, Amen, combined with Ra, so Amen or Amen-Ra, had been the chief god of ancient Egypt. So in Egypt, you had multiple gods, of course, but there was always one god that was the supreme god, the capital G god. In this case, it was Amen-Ra. And Amen-Ra, his temple in Waset and his temples across the country were the big church. Now, there were, of course, other deities that people prayed to and did different things to, but the god was Amen-Ra. And the chief priest of Amen-Ra was a key spiritual and political figure in ancient Egypt. All the pharaohs respected this. Everybody understood this. And that chief priest had a lot of individual power. And the church of Amen-Ra, the temples of Amen-Ra, had a lot of power. Again, this is just like church nowadays. A lot of sacrifice, a lot of money is going into these temples. So every time people would give offering, some of it would go to maintenance of the church, and then a lot of it would go to the priests, just like today, where you go to church and you give your offering, some of that goes to your pastor. And if you got an unscrupulous pastor, it goes in their pocket. Well, the same thing was happening back then. So you got the chief priest of Amen-Ra. You got this whole temple complex of Amen-Ra going on. And you have these pharaohs. Well, when Amenhotep IV comes and takes over from his father, he makes some decisions. Now, his name, Amenhotep, which means God's peace. Whenever you see Hotep, that means peace. So Amenhotep, God, the great God's peace. He gets married and he becomes pharaoh. He's married to the beautiful Nefertiti, and he actually ushers in a new era of Egyptian art. It kind of started a little bit before his time, but it really takes off during his time. This is the time period where the art in Egypt becomes very realistic. And he tells the sculptors and the painters and the craftsmen, listen, draw me as I am. See, back before that, before him, pharaohs looked like this. this was the general understanding of how the pharaoh was represented. We don't know if this is what Tutmosis III looked like in real life. We don't know if he was that muscular and could just grab people up like that, but this is how the pharaohs were depicted, as strong warriors, virile. Even going back to Hatshepsut, how she depicted herself is very similar understanding of how we draw and sculpt the pharaoh. Akhenaten says, no, don't do that. I got a pot belly, I got wide hips, I got skinny legs, skinny arms. This is how I want to be drawn. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about military prowess. I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover, not a fighter. This is this guy's mentality. I'm going to talk about peace. I'm going to do these things. I'm not even really that much concerned with the goings on of the state. And this is how he's operating. People are kind of like, okay, this is interesting, but he's the pharaoh. We'll let it ride. But then into his reign, he decides that he's going to change his name to Akhenaten, Akhenaten. And then he says, I'm going to move the capital to a new city that I'm building called Amarna. It's going to be a completely new city out in the desert, dedicated to the god Aten. Now, Aten had been a god, had been a deity. It was a representation of Ra, the sun. It was the sun disk itself. And he said, this is going to be the new god. And not only that, the Aten, the sun disk, and its rays that are giving life to the world, this is going to be the only God. He's one of the first historical figures to say, there's only one God. All these other gods that we had, Jehuti, and Heru or Horus, and Aset or Isis, and Hathor, and most importantly, Amen-Ra, dustpan of history, pushing that to the side. There's only one God, is represented as the sun disk, Aten, and more importantly, me and my family are the chief priest and priestess, me and my wife are the chief priest and priestess of this new faith. So I'm going to build a brand new city dedicated to this God. I'm moving the capital here. I'm shutting down all the temples to the other deities, and especially the temples to Amen-Ra. I'm shutting them down. Now, you can imagine what this is doing, what this does to the people. The people that have said for generations, almost 1,000 years now, going back to the Middle Kingdom, that Amen-Ra is God. And they've been making offerings to all these deities, and now he's shutting down. So imagine you go to the service one day, you try to go into the church, and it's locked. The door's locked on order of the Pharaoh that, no, you can't, you got to go worship his God. And then you got to think about these powerful priests of Amen-Ra that got their own money, their own land, that have been living off the offerings of the people and all that. They're pissed. They're like, hey, wait a minute, what? Now we're destitute because we can't even be priests to this new Aten thing because he's saying he's the only priest. So a lot of discontent in Europe. Andrew, go. Europe, Egypt. Go ahead.
Yeah. Long story short, they were like really upset because, like as you said, they've been doing this for like 1,000 years, and when it stops, people are like at first they let it slide, like the artwork, okay, why not? And another thing is you don't get to see like even King Tut, like he's portrayed as like this powerful ruler, but then you look at his money.
Yeah.
And you realize that that does not portray, like even one of the coffins looks so different that some people speculate it was for a different pharaoh. And then he starts doing away with the gods, and long story short, they're angry, and it doesn't go well. And to the point that when he died, King Tut had to pick up the pieces, and even then, people were still upset at him.
He does a lot of damage to this family's reputation, this 18th dynasty, because of what he does. But again, I just want to show you the artwork, how his family's depicted, how he's depicted, you know, the lips, the wide hips, the gut, you know, he's a very interesting figure how he draws. And he's one of the few pharaohs to show scenes with his family and shows him kissing his daughter and things that you didn't see in other pharaohs. Other pharaohs were shown, again, in his military light, he's powerful. He's showing these family images, so something very different. He composes hymns to the Aten. One of his hymns to the Aten is very similar to one of the Psalms, actually. It's very, very similar. Some people are like, why is it so similar? Well, he's talking about what the otten does and how the otten makes the grass grow and the cows eat from it and all this. And it's very similar to, I think it's Psalm, I'll bring it next week. I think it's 124, but I'm not sure on the number. But you can look up and see the similarities. Anyway, so you see this. Well, Andrew's correct. It's so much discontent when he dies. And there was some speculation about whether he was murdered or not, or what happened. Because it was regicide in ancient Egypt where they would kill pharaohs. But we don't know one way or the other because his mummy hasn't been found. It probably was defaced and chopped up because people were so upset about what he did. And you see, after he died, first one of his daughters actually takes over for a little bit, a couple other people, and his son was too young to rule, but he actually takes over. And it's really interesting because you see the change. He goes from being Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten. His son is born Tutankhaten. That's his birth name, Tutankhaten. However, when his father dies and there's changes, those supporters of the old god of Amen-Ra come back into power, and they influence this new young pharaoh, and he changes his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, going back to his family's allegiance to Amen or Amen-Ra. That's why he has the name Tutankhamun. Amen. But he dies relatively young. There's another 2 pharaohs that take over, but this dynasty, this 18th dynasty, is in shambles basically because of what Akhenaten does, and there's a military coup. And a new military takes over, and is led by a man named Seti. Seti I, who was a very powerful ruler, and he starts the 19th dynasty. And after Seti comes his son, Ramses II, probably the most well-known pharaoh outside of Tutankhamun in terms of name recognition. Ramses II, just like Thutmose III, was a very powerful military figure, at least according to him. Again, these are Egyptian records, so of course, every victory that he wins is 10 times bigger than what it probably actually was. So Ramses talks about all the people that he's defeated. He goes back to the traditional style of depicting the pharaoh. He actually rules for something like 60 years, and he lives an incredibly long life, particularly even in today's standards. I think he lives into his 90s, and he fathers hundreds of children throughout his life. So he definitely ensures that his family's going to reign for a while. And he builds tremendous monuments. This one is at Abu Simbel. This is right at the gateway to Nubia. So the Nubians are still a strong presence in the region, and the Egyptians and the Nubians are fighting over the frontier, over the border, the first cataract. So Ramses builds this temple at Abu Simbel, these huge colossuses. This is an incredible work. And it was done facing Nubia, so the Nubians knew, like, Egypt is establishing its authority over this frontier region. So you see these colossuses of Ramses II. Now, a few generations later, I'm going to close it up soon. A few generations later, you have Ramses III. So this is not his son. This is a later descendant who takes the name Ramses III. He's like the opposite. Ramses III has a lot of problems during his reign. One is the workers' strike of 1150 BCE. This is the first recorded workers' strike in world history. The craftsmen that are working on his monuments, because he wants to be like his great ancestor Ramses II, he wants to build all these monuments, but you got to pay people. And these workers and the craftsmen had contracts that they wanted to be honored. These people were paid in bread. They were paid actually in beer. Beer was something that the ancient Egyptians drank a lot because back in ancient times, it wasn't always safe to drink water. So people drank a lot of wine, not to get drunk, it was diluted. So it wasn't, you weren't drunk all day. But people drank beer, it was filling, it could keep you going. They drank wine. So people were paid in beer, they were paid in bread, they were paid in grain, and they expected a certain amount of payment for the work that they did. Just like all of us, we work and we expect to be paid for our work. Well, the administrators and the bureaucracy come to these workers and say, hey, that contract we had with you, we can't afford to pay you, sorry. But keep working because the pharaoh wants this monument done. The workers say, no, we're getting off the job. And we're going to picket, and we're going to go to the governor, and we're going to go to the pharaoh, and we're going to give our grievances, and no work is going to be done. There's not going to be any stone cutting. There's not going to be any painting. There's not going to be any etching into the stone. All of that is done. We're walking off the job, and they did. And they were actually successful in negotiating to get the things that they want. But this is the first recorded worker strike. And we know this from, again, records that were left behind in the area that they worked at. We have pottery shards with writing on them that talk about the strike, that talk about the lives of these people, because they would use pottery shards as notes. Because again, if you break a plate, it's hard to break a plate to the point that you can't put it back together. It might take a long time to put it back together, but you break something, you can still use it to write on. So you had these garbage dumps in ancient Egypt that we found through archaeology, where you have all these writing on these pottery shards. People would pick up a pottery shard, write down a note, and give it to somebody, and then they could read it, and then they would use it like that. So we have all of this evidence of what went down with the strike, and these people, again, were able to get what they deserved. It's very similar to what's going on now. There's all types of strikes going on right now. There's a strike of port workers, or a potential strike of port workers. The Hollywood writers and actors are on strike right now. That's a big strike going on. The first recorded world strike, a strike in world history, happened in Africa, among these African workers that say, we're not going to be exploited. We're not going to exploit our labor. So that's one thing that happened during the time of Ramses III. Another thing that happened is he was assassinated by one of his wives. This is called the Great Harem Conspiracy. And we know about this because it's written on a long papyrus of this trial that happened after the pharaoh got his throat slit. And he didn't die at first. It was a botched assassination. I mean, he eventually dies, but not before he could see the trial happen, and he dies from his injuries later on. But it turns out that a couple of the wives in his harem collaborated with some other people in the office, and they assassinated the pharaoh. They had his throat slit, and that's how he went out. So, not the best reign for Ramses III. He has a workers' strike. He gets his throat slit. So a number of things, but it just goes to show political intrigue and all of these things and jealousy and all. A movie could be made about this. And we have all the records in this papyrus of what happened. So all this was happening in the New Kingdom. At the same time in Kush, you have Kush developing. They had a new capital that's further south in Napata. That was the capital of Kush from around 1100 BCE to 600 BCE. After Egypt's New Kingdom falls, because not long after the 19th dynasty, we have a couple of dynasties, but the New Kingdom falls, just like kingdoms do. Egypt goes into a third intermediate period, and then Egypt ends up being conquered by a number of other outside groups, including the Nubians. After the fall of the New Kingdom in Egypt, the Nubians come up from Nubia, and they say, you know what? Let's just take over all of Egypt. Let's stop playing around with this thing, fighting over the first cataract. Let's just take over the whole thing. And at the time, the Nubians were powerful enough to do so. And they become the 25th dynasty. There's a dynasty in between, one that comes from Libya. There's actually a Libyan dynasty in Egypt where folks from what's now Libya come over and take over Egypt. Well, now this is a dynasty from the south. The Nubians come from Napata, and they establish Thebes and reestablish Thebes as their capital. Because at this time, remember, we talked about Amen-Ra being the main god in Egypt. At the same time, Amen-Ra was the main god in Nubia since the Middle Kingdom. So they're both worshiping the same god at this point. So these Nubians take over, and they start the 25th dynasty, and they adopt, again, a lot of this, the title of pharaoh, and they take over as pharaohs. It starts with Pianki, and then his son Shabaka, then the grandson Taharka. These are the three pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, Taharka probably being the most famous. Taharka is actually mentioned in the Bible, because while all this is going on, this is happening in the 600 BCE. Taharka, they built this monument at Jebel Bakar in Lower Nubia. Taharka is mentioned in 2 Kings in the Bible. The Israelites are having some problems with some of their neighbors, and this is after the time of David and Solomon. So this is around, again, if Taharka lived in 640 to 600 BCE, this is around that time. The biblical text says, and when they heard say of Taharka, king of Ethiopia, behold, he has come out to fight against thee. He sent messengers again to Hezekiah saying, so the enemies of King Hezekiah of the Israelites are shaking in their boots because they hear that Taharka, the king of Ethiopia, is coming. He's around the corner, so they need to beware. So he's written about in the Bible, because this is how far their empire stretched. They took over everything from actually down to the Sixth Cataract, all the way up to control all of Egypt. I'll stop there for the day. Later on, after this period, the Nubians would move their capital again from Napata to Merowe, and it's around 500 BC that they start producing iron in Nubia. Very important technological advancement. The civilizations that produce iron, they're able to create better weapons. They're able to create better agricultural tools. So you grow your community by producing more food, and you can defend your community better and take over other communities with iron production. We're going to see this throughout African history. Once civilizations start using iron, they blossom into superpowers. Same thing that happens with Nubia once they move to the capital to Merowe. And at the same time, around 200 BCE, they develop writing. So they develop iron and then writing. And this is where we get the Merowitic script to talk about these things. And Merowe continues to be a superpower even after Egypt starts to decline. Because after the 25th dynasty, Egypt is conquered by the Assyrians. Then Egypt is conquered by the Persians. Then Egypt is conquered by the Greeks. And then finally, Egypt is conquered by the Romans. Well, not finally, because they're conquered by the Romans. Then Egypt is conquered by the Arabs. So you get all of these outside forces that come and conquer Egypt. Egypt has always been a prize for people that want to dominate the world, even up to the modern time with France and Britain. But back then, that's what happened. But while all that was happening, Nubia stayed strong. And I'll end with this, and then we'll close out. One of the other aspects of Nubia had even more female monarchs than Egypt. And a preponderance of female monarchs, known as the Kendakes. These are the female queens that ruled Nubia. And there's a lot of them. And they were very powerful. And I'll tell the story of one. They're so powerful that, again, they're mentioned in the Bible as well. In terms of, I think this is Acts. We see the conversion of one of her eunuchs. It says, an Ethiopian, a eunuch, a minister of Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of all her treasure. This eunuch was converted to Christianity. It's important when we look at this short passage, everything it tells us. One, it has the name Candace. This is where, if you know anybody named Candace, this is where it comes from. But it's really a Greek mistranslation of Kendake, which is not a name, it's a title. So the Kendake was the title of the queen of the Ethiopians, or the queen of the Nubians. She had so much power and influence that apparently the minister in charge of her treasures was doing business in Palestine, which means she had a reach going all the way into Western Asia. That's how much power this woman exercised, that she had people doing her business all the way in Palestine. And one of her ministers got converted to Christianity. So very important to point that out. But the one I want to mention today, what we'll close class with today, is Queen Amani Reines. One of the most powerful women that you've probably never heard of. But she was a defender of Nubia. Like I mentioned before. And it's funny, because everybody knows the story of Cleopatra VII. She was the subject of the Netflix movie that got a lot of attention because they dared to cast a black woman as Cleopatra VII. But in all actuality, Cleopatra VII is not really that important to African history. She's much more important to European history. She's not inconsequential, but she was the last independent pharaoh of Egypt. She was conquered by the Romans. Long story short, she had gotten a relationship with Julius Caesar. The Romans killed Julius Caesar because he was trying to become a king. The Romans didn't like kings at the time. They killed Julius Caesar. Then there's a power vacuum in Rome. There's two people that can be the heirs to Caesar. His nephew, Octavian, and his main general, Mark Antony. Mark Antony ends up marrying Cleopatra. They have children. He becomes her ally. There's a civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Long story short, Mark Antony and Cleopatra lose that civil war, and Octavian becomes the first emperor of Rome, and he takes the title Augustus. He becomes Emperor Augustus. He's the first Roman emperor. He's a nephew of Julius Caesar. So when he takes over Egypt, he becomes one of the most powerful men in the world. He controls everything, pretty much everything you see in yellow. They take them a minute to get Britain, but they control mostly everything you see in yellow, the Romans. Now, after taking control of Egypt, the forces of Augustus, now Augustus himself, no matter how he's depicted here, he was a sickly person. He was much more of a philosopher than a general. He wasn't a fighter. He had great generals. He was a good delegator. He had good generals. He wasn't a good fighter himself. But his generals realized that, okay, we got Egypt, but the real prize is Nubia to the south. Let's take over Nubia. But they had to come up against this African queen, Amani-Reines. If they should make a movie about anyone, it should be her. So the Romans are looking like they're going to attack Nubia. She doesn't wait for them to get their troops ready. She crosses the first cataract into Egypt and attacks the Romans. And now the war is on between the most powerful man in the world and probably at the time the most powerful woman in the world, because she's the ruler of Nubia. Their forces clash. And this is written about by the Romans as well as other folks, even the Greeks. When this battle happens, the Romans suffer so many losses that they decide to sign a peace treaty with Nubia, saying we will never invade Nubia. And according to one of the Roman chroniclers, during one of these battles, again, because Augustus wasn't actually there, the Nubians took a bust of the Emperor Augustus, the statue of the Emperor Augustus. They beheaded it and then buried it underneath the front entry to Queen Amani-Reines' palace. That way, every day when she woke up, she could walk over the Roman emperor. Now, people thought, oh, this is just something nice that the Romans made up and all that. However, in recent years, in the 20th century, when they were doing archaeological excavations in the area, they found her palace, and lo and behold, they found a statue of Augustus where the Roman chroniclers said it was. So that actually is what happened. So she was able to defend Nubia from one of the most powerful armies in the world. And she, unlike Augustus, was on the front line. The Romans talk about how she led her troops. They say she had one eye that she had lost in battle. And of course, the Romans tried to paint her as ugly as possible because they were just so appalled that a woman was leading her troops in the battle and fighting. Romans had this thing with gender because even when they fought in Britain, they fought against Boudica, the British, or I think she was either Irish or British woman that fought against the Romans. So as we end class today, we'll stop there with this story. But this is one of the most powerful African women in history that you should all know of, Queen Amani-Reines. We'll stop there today, and when we pick up next week in week 4, we're going to move to the west, and we're going to talk about another enemy of Rome coming out of Africa. We're going to talk about Carthage in North Africa, and we're going to talk about the Numidians in North Africa, and the great general Hannibal Barca, and what was going on in this part of Africa. So we're moving further to the west, and then we're going to make our counterclockwise move around Africa over the next weeks. We're going to go from Carthage to talking about Ghana. Then we're going to talk about some other areas like Camden, Bornu, and some other places. We're going to go in this direction. So stick with us. This is going to end week 3. Please go to our course website, look up any materials. If you missed the lecture, the recordings will be there. This recording will be there. And yeah, we'll stop there for the day and open it up for general discussion. All right. Anything in the chat? Any questions?